I had the opportunity recently to sit down with Congressman Jake Auchincloss from Massachusetts' 4th Congressional District. He's a Democrat and told me about how he thinks young voters will impact this election and the work he's done in his own district to engage with that voting bloc. So we have these screens over here, and you guys can take a listen to that. Thank you. Congressman Auchincloss, thank you so much for joining us. Just to jump right into this, we have really seen a sea change among, voters in general, particularly Democratic voters and young voters, from when President Biden was at the top of the ticket to now that Kamala Harris, the Vice President Harris, is at the top of the ticket. It seemed that younger voters in particular were somewhat less enthusiastic about Biden at the top of the ticket, but now there seems to be so much excitement with Kamala Harris at the top of the ticket. What is she doing differently here? Why are they so much more enthusiastic about her?
There's no question Kamala Harris has closed the enthusiasm gap in the Democratic base. Joe Biden, when he was at the top of the ticket, was underperforming with voters under 30, with voters of color. And basically overnight, that enthusiasm gap closed. I think there's a number of reasons. One of them is that it felt like Washington was listening. There was this building anxiety about the age and acuity of the president and about his ability to win in November. And it sort of felt like people weren't listening or responding to that concern. And then all of a sudden they were. And as Nikki Haley said months ago, the party that changes the top of its ticket will win the election. Democrats did it, Republicans didn't, and I think Democrats will win the election because of it.
Right, and moving into the election, I know that Democrats seem very enthused across the board about this idea of young voters being, energized Generation Z voters. So many of them are first-time voters this election cycle. But just looking at data, and I'm looking at a U.S. News and World Report survey, it found that 48% of 18 to 24-year-olds turned out in 2020. While nearly 80% of voters 65 years and older turned out. It seems like younger voters are less reliable than older voters. How do you guys flip the script on that? How do you guys, essentially, how are you able to make sure that these voters turn out in November or even before November through vote by mail or voting early?
I don't think it's realistic to flip the script entirely in one election cycle. This is a generational project. Younger voters have almost always turned out at lower numbers than baby boomer, or I should say as the older generation voters have. And that's a persistent trend that I think would be unrealistic to say, oh, we're going to flip that script in the next 2 months. But we can boost turnout in this election and then going forward. I think there's a number of ways to do it. One, yes, early voting and vote by mail. I think grassroots organizing, in the 2020 cycle, because of COVID, that was, I think, discounted. But knocking on doors, which is how I got my start in politics, and digital relational organizing, where you have individuals reaching out one-on-one to others to talk about why they support this issue or why they support this candidate as people, can be very effective. And there's a pretty good corpus of political science research that demonstrates that. So I think that we need that grassroots approach.
So, I want to dig in on that a little bit. How do you reach these young voters? You often hear that, they're on TikTok, they're on Instagram Reels, they're on social media, but, they're also on college campuses. They're also in other communities. How should campaigns target these voters, and how do they find out really where they are?
I think this is a question not just for younger voters, but for all voters. In the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, the United States media was in an unusually concentrated moment where it was a few broadcast channels, a few newspapers that were able to set the agenda and control a huge amount of the medium. That's no longer the case. And in some ways, that's actually reverting back to how U.S. political discourse was structured in the 19th century, where there was lots of different organs of communication, such as the case now. You got Discord channels and Reddit threads and TikTok and Twitter and in-person events. The short answer is there's just no shortcut. You got to do all of it. I mean, that is really what campaigning is about. You have to go wherever voters are. And that is one of the intentions that I have as I'm out there as a surrogate and as a campaigner myself, both for Kamala Harris and for my Beyond Thoughts and Prayers political action committee that's dedicated to a gun violence prevention majority in Congress, is just go reach people wherever they are consuming information.
Right. And, just to talk about the issues voters care about, you mentioned one right there, gun violence. Obviously, voters across the age spectrum care about this, but I know for younger voters who are going to school, this is obviously a very personal issue. When you're in Massachusetts' 4th Congressional District, what other issues are young voters, Gen Z voters, millennial voters telling you they're most concerned about?
Gun violence prevention, as you indicated, is a top tier issue, not just for younger voters, but for all voters. And we have a suite of policies that will save lives. It is not a fact of life, as J.D. Vance claims. This is a matter of politics. And if we win the election for the House, for the Senate, for the presidency, we can enact things like a federal assault weapons ban, like universal background checks, like safe storage laws that will save tens of thousands of lives. And I think that young people feel that imperative. The other big one is cost of housing. It's the single most important domestic policy issue in the United States, and it's particularly poignant in Massachusetts, where we are paralyzing our economy because young people cannot afford to buy a house and they can't afford to live near their employment base.
So one issue that seems to have really hit a lot of young voters seem to care about, they feel passionate about. There's two sides to it, obviously, is the Israel-Hamas war and the U.S. response to it. A Pew Research poll, this was taken in April prior to President Biden dropping out, found that 36% of 18 to 29-year-olds said that they believed Biden was favoring Israel too much, while 12% said they believed he was striking the right balance. We know that Kamala Harris has been the vice president during the Biden administration. A lot of this is an extension of his policy, but how do Democrats walk that fine line of hearing out both sides of this issue, hearing out, young Palestinian and Arab Americans who are upset with how the U.S. has responded to the war, but also hearing out, the other side, the Israeli side, and also, the side of Jewish Americans who feel that they have been targeted through anti-Semitism?
Yeah, I think it starts with rejecting the premise that Israelis and Palestinians need necessarily be on opposite sides, that there have to be two sides opposed to one another. I am pro-Israel and I am pro-Palestinian because I believe that both peoples can and should live in security and dignity and prosperity. What I am against is Hamas. I am against an internationally recognized terrorist organization that took 6 young hostages, had them record videos to their families, and then shot them execution style. And I think we have to maintain our moral clarity as political leaders and as a country that says, we want no part in what Hamas is offering. And if you're out there protesting, waving a Hamas flag, you're wrong. But also say that, of course, we want the Palestinian people to have the dignity and security of self-determination. And those two things are not mutually exclusive. In fact, they are synergistic. I think the other thing we have to recognize is that as much oxygen as this issue has consumed, it is not a voting issue for the vast majority of Americans and, frankly, the vast majority of young voters as well. When you look at what people walk into the ballot booth thinking about, it's cost of living, it's reproductive rights, it's immigration. There are 3, maybe 4 highly salient issues upon which this election will pivot.
Finally, Congressman, the partisanship in DC and the political discourse, as you and I both know, has gotten quite negative. And I think a lot of Americans, including young voters, feel very turned off to that. Is there a fear that these young voters will sort of want to block out the noise and stay home instead of, turning out and going to the ballot box ahead of November?
It's incumbent upon elected officials like me to demonstrate integrity and stewardship of the Constitution. I would also, though, say it is a challenge to this generation of Americans to not view democracy as a spectator sport that they can tune out of or change their channel on, but instead get engaged. You don't like how Washington is operating, then organize. If you think that there are issues that need to be changed, then go run for city council or school committee. But most of all, you got to go out there and vote. I think we're going to see, and I'm excited to see Gen Z help to rebuild some of the institutions of trust in this country, whether it's local news, whether it is local government, and whether it is the way the political parties operate at the state and federal level through things like ranked choice voting or nonpartisan primaries, for example. We have a lot of different levers to press on to rebuild trust, but my challenge to Gen Z is don't complain about it. Don't be cynical about it. Come help change it.
Congressman Jake Auchincloss, thank you so much for joining us today. We really appreciate your insight.
Good to be with you.